First thing we're going to do is look at the 5 marker lights across the top of the cab. Make sure they're amber in color. Make sure they're not cracked or broken and in working order. We're going to look at the windshield. Make sure it's not cracked or broken. Look at the rubber grommet. Make sure it's not dry rotted or cracked that would cause the windshield to leak. We're going to look at the windshield wipers. Make sure the arms are not bent or damaged. Make sure the rubber is in good shape and it can wipe the water off of the windshield. We're going to check the hood. Make sure the hood latches are latched correctly and the hinges are not rusted or anything. And we're going to look at the hood, make sure it's not damaged in any way. We're going to make sure the grill is on the truck and it's not broken or damaged. And look at the headlights and turn signals. Make sure they're clear and clean, and make sure they're in working order, not cracked or broken. And check the bumper. Make sure it's mounted securely, not missing or damaged. Check the tag. Make sure it's mounted securely and clean and visible where you can read. We're going to look under the truck to make sure there's no puddles or anything under the truck, such as antifreeze or oil that would indicate a leak. Look and see if it's leaning to one side or the other. That might indicate a broken spring or a low tire. And then we're going to take a check underneath it to see if the engine or transmission is dripping or anything that would indicate a smaller leak. We're going to check the oil. Make sure it's above the add mark, and it is. If it was below, we would have put some oil in it. Check the power steering fluid. Make sure it's above the minimum. It is. If it wasn't, we would add fluid to it. And check our coolant level. Make sure it's above add. It is. If it wasn't, we would have added to it. The transmission fluid, we need to check it with the engine running at operating temperature, but when we do that prior to coming over, and we check it and it's good. The windshield washer fluid's on the other side. We'll check it, make sure it's got plenty of fluid in it in case there's anything on the windshield we need to wash out. The radiator, make sure it's mounted securely, not leaking. The radiator hoses, make sure their clamps are tight. Make sure there's no leaks or drips off the hoses. The water pump, make sure it's mounted securely. Make sure it's not leaking or damaged. And right here we've got the air compressor. It is belt driven. We're going to make sure it's not leaking or damaged. There's no frayed lines. And we're going to make sure that the proper tension is on the belt. It would be less than 3/4 inch push when you push on. You're going to check all your wires and your connections. Make sure there's no frayed wires or no loose connections or anything. We're going to make sure that the starter is mounted securely. There's no frayed wires and it's in working order. The alternator, make sure that it's mounted securely. There's no frayed wires or corrosion. Make sure the belt has the proper tension. It's less than 3/4 inch push. We have another belt tensioner right here. Make sure that it's not bouncing or making a noise. We're going to check all the radiator hoses. Make sure all the clamps are tight. And we're going to look for any type of leak or anything on the radiator hoses. The steering shaft, make sure it's not damaged or bent. Make sure the universal joints are not loose or worn and they're well lubed. The steering gearbox, make sure it's mounted securely. All the bolts are intact and it's not leaking or damaged. The pitman rod, make sure that it's not bent or damaged and the castle nuts and the pins are in place. The drag link, make sure that it's not bent or damaged. Make sure it's well lubed. Kingpin, make sure it's well lubed, not worn, bent or damaged. The tie rod end and tie rod, make sure that it's not bent or damaged. And the castle nuts in place and pin, and make sure the tie rod's not worn. We're going to check the hangers, make sure both of them are intact, the bolts are tight and not broken or damaged, and there's no cracks. We're going to look at the springs, make sure none of them is missing or cracked or broken. The 2 U-bolts, make sure they're on, not cracked or broken, and the nuts are on the bottom and tight. The shock absorber, make sure it's mounted securely. Check the airline, make sure it's not frayed or leaking. The brake chamber, make sure it's mounted securely and not leaking or damaged. The slack adjuster, make sure it's got less than 1 inch pull. And the pins and push rods, make sure they're not bent or damaged. The S-cam, make sure it's not damaged and it's well lubed. The S-cam tube, make sure it's not cracked or broken and it's well lubed. The brake shoe, which is inside, make sure that it's got a 1/4 inch remaining and make sure it's wearing evenly. The brake drum, make sure it's not cracked or broken and it cannot be welded. The rim, make sure it's not dented or damaged. The lug nuts, make sure they're tight. Loose lug nuts will be indicated by shiny threads or rust streak. The wheel seal, make sure it's not leaking or damaged and the bolts are on tight. The valve stem, make sure it's not leaking or damaged and the cap's on tight. The tire, we're going to check for cuts and gouges on the inside and outside of the tire. We're going to check for uneven wear. Must have 4/32 tread wear remaining. Must be a new tire and must match the tread on the other side. Must have 95 to 105 pound of pressure. We're at the driver's door. We're going to make sure the door opens and closes properly and that the hinges inside are not damaged and the pins are in good shape, which you can see right here, the hinge and pins. Make sure they're not damaged or wore and that the door closes and opens properly. We're going to check the windows to make sure they're not cracked or damaged. We want to make sure they're clean and the rubber grommets are not dry rotted or cracked so they would be leaking or anything. The mirror hanger and brackets, make sure it's mounted securely to the truck. Make sure the brackets are not bent or damaged. We have a West Coast mirror. Make sure that it's mounted securely, adjusted properly, clean, and no rust on the mirror where moisture's getting behind it. We got a spot mirror or convex mirror. Make sure that it's mounted securely, not cracked or broken, and that it don't have any rust and that it's clear for vision. Your grab handle, make sure it's mounted securely and no burrs so you can get in and out of the truck correctly. Your steps, make sure they're mounted securely so that the exit and entering into the truck is good. We have our battery box right here. We're going to check our battery box, make sure it's mounted securely, which it is. And then we're going to check on our batteries. We're going to look at them by removing the cover. We're going to check for frayed wires, make sure the batteries are mounted securely in the box, and if there's no corrosion or anything in the batteries, and they're securely mounted. Our air tanks, we're going to make sure they're mounted with 2 straps. It should be metal. And check our air lines, make sure there's no frayed airs. Our tanks, make sure they're not leaking or damaged, and make sure we drain our tanks and free of water, and we do that daily. Make sure our drive line is not bent or damaged. It's down here, and make sure our universal joints are well lubed and not worn or damaged. Our carrier bearing, make sure that it's not making a noise and it's not worn or damaged. The frame rail on the truck, make sure it's not cracked or broken, and make sure it doesn't have any illegal welds. The bed frames, and make sure there's no big rust spots or anything or holes in the bottom of the bed where anything will come out during the trip or anything. The side of the bed, make sure it's free from anything that may fall off or anything that's damaged. Got an amber marker light in the front, a red marker light in the back. Make sure they're not cracked or damaged. Make sure they're in working order and clean. We have mud flaps. Make sure they're mounted securely, not broken or damaged, and are the proper distance from the ground and the tire to where they don't get damaged. The one in the back, make sure it's the proper distance from the tire and the ground so it don't get damaged. It's a rubber one, so you want to make sure it's not torn or anything, and check the bolts to make sure they're intact and tight. Here we're going to check the air line, make sure it's not frayed or damaged. This is a double brake chamber. Going to make sure that it's mounted securely, not leaking or damaged. We're going to check our slack adjuster and make sure it doesn't pull more than 1 inch. And the push rods and pins, make sure they're in place, not bent or damaged. The S-cam and S-cam tube we're going to make sure they're not cracked or damaged and that they're well lubed. And then the brake shoe, we're going to check and make sure it's got a 1/4 inch wear remaining and make sure it's wearing evenly. The brake drum, make sure it's not cracked or broken and it cannot be welded. Make sure the rims are not bent or damaged, inside and outside both. Check in between the tires and make sure there's nothing there that could come out like a rock or anything like that. Check your tires on each side, make sure there's no cuts or gouges. Check for even wear, tread wear. These must have 2/32 tread wear remaining. They can be recaps, but the tread must match the other side. You're going to check, make sure they've got 95 to 105 pound of pressure. You're going to check your inside valve stem and outside valve stem. Make sure the cap's on tight and it's not leaking or damaged. This is a leaf type tailgate. The hinges at the top, we're going to check the hinges, make sure the pins are in working order and it's securely mounted. The latches at the bottom, make sure the latches are working correctly and that the tailgate is latched and in working order. Make sure that our reflective tape, DOT reflective tape, is on the truck. We have brake lights and signal lights from down at the bottom and on the sides. We're going to make sure each one of them is not cracked or broken and that the not damaged and is in working order. We're going to check our 5 red marker lights. We got 3 at the bottom and 1 on each side at the top. Make sure they're clear and clean and in working order and not cracked or broken. We're going to check the bed pin. Make sure it's well lubed. It's not bent or damaged in case we raise the bed and everything. You got your electrical connections. Make sure that there are no frayed wires or corrosion. You got your hydraulic hookups. Make sure that they're not leaking or damaged. Your pintle hook. Make sure there's no cracks or breaks. Your chain hooks. Make sure that they're not cracked or broken and that they're securely mounted. System. We're going to check the exhaust system to make sure all the clamps are tight. Any leak would be indicated by a set mark. We're going to make sure all the hangers are in place and not rusted or broken so that the exhaust will be intact and not loose or ready to fall off, and check the whole exhaust system for leaks of any kind and they will be indicated by black set marks. The frame rail on this side, we would look at it just like we did the other side for any illegal welds, cracks, or breaks. And we'll check the steps and make sure they're mounted securely for entering and exiting the vehicle. We're going to make sure that the tank has got 2 metal straps and that the rubber behind it is in good shape so it don't wear a hole in the tank. We're going to check the tank and make sure it's not leaking or damaged. We're going to check the cap, make sure the cap's on tight, make sure there's enough fuel in the tank to make her trip. We're going to check the sending unit and the fuel line, make sure there's no leaking line or frayed wires to the sending unit. Alright, we got in here, we're going to check our doors to make sure they open and close correctly. We're going to check the locks to make sure that the locks work, make sure that the windows roll up and down, and we're going to do that for both doors. We're going to check all the glass, make sure it's clean, not broken or damaged, windshield, side doors, back panel. Make sure there's nothing on the dash that would obstruct our sight or anything during travel. We're going to check the sun visors, make sure they're working properly, that they'll come down and there's nothing behind them that will fall out during our trip in case we need to use them. We'll check the steering wheel, make sure there's not excessive play in the steering wheel. There should be no more than 2 inches or 10%. I'm going to make sure the horn blows by hitting the horn and making it blow. I'm going to check my lights. I'm going to turn on my headlights. And I'm going to check my right turn signal. The green light is flashing. Left turn signal, the green light is flashing. The bright is working correctly because I get the bright light. My 4-ways, I'm going to turn them on. Both green lights are flashing and I can hear it going. And I'm going to turn on my windshield wipers to make sure that they work. And then I'm going to push make sure that it is spraying. So the windshield wipers are working and the spray is spraying. And then I'm going to start the truck up so I can check all my gauges. The oil pressure gauge should go up to operating range. The water gauge, as the truck warms up, it should go up to operating range and stay. The RPM gauge is working correctly. The speedometer, as we go, we'll be able to see that. The fuel gauge is working at 1/4 of a tank. That I made sure it matched. 1/4 of a tank was in there, so it's at 1/4 of a tank. And the voltmeter is working. Primary and secondary air gauge is off at 120 and holding, so they're working correctly. I'm going to check the air conditioner and the defroster, make sure it blows. I can feel it blowing. I switched it over to the defrost and I can feel it blowing. Make sure the radio's not frayed and all your connections here is in working order. Make sure the transmission shifter works properly. Switching the gears, and make sure the brake pedal and the fuel pedal is in working order. And I'm going to check the floor to make sure there's nothing in the floor that will roll out under the pedals or obstruct my feet during travel. I'm going to check the seat, make sure that it's adjusted correctly, that there's no holes or gouges in the seat or anything. I'm going to check my seat belt, make sure it's not cut or damaged, make sure everything's good. Make sure the latches work correctly and it latches good and unlatches so it works. And I'm going to do that with all the seat belts in the truck. And I'm going to check under the seat to make sure that I have a fire extinguisher, 3 safety triangles. I'm going to check for the registration and the insurance card, which should be up here. I'm going to check for the pre-trip book to make sure nothing that was broken in the prior one that wasn't fixed or anything to that nature. And I'm going to check for spare fuses and circuit breakers, which is right here. Make sure that they're in there in case I have a fuse blow. And with the city, we put a first aid kit that we try to keep in here too. So I check that to make sure the first aid kit is in the truck. And I'm going to check my brake by turning off the truck. The temperature are built up to 120 and kicked off. I'm going to wait 1 minute to make sure that there is no leak or anything in the system. And it has been 60 seconds. I hear no leak and there's no visual move of the needles. So I'm going to press the brake and I'm going to hold it for another minute. It should take less than 10 pounds of air to apply the brake. And then as I hold it for 60 seconds, it shouldn't leak more than 2 pounds. So apply the brake. You can see the needles go down and it is held now. It took about 10 pounds. And I'm holding it, listening for a leak. And it's been 60 seconds and I've heard no leak and I've seen no movement of the needles. So there is not an apparent air leak. So with the key on and make sure the brake is mashed in, I'm going to pump the brake down now. And at 60 pounds, the light and buzzer should come on. Indicate low air pressure. The light and the buzzer has come on at 60 pounds. I'm going to continue to pump it down, and around 35 to 40 pounds, the park brake should pop out, and the park brake popped out, so the park brake is working correctly. I'm going to start the truck back up, and it should, within 3 minutes, build back up to 120 pounds of pressure if the air compressor is working correctly. And during this time, I'm going to check on the park brake to make sure that it's in working order. I'm going to put the truck in gear. I'm actually going to give it just a little bit of fuel. And as you see, it's not moving, so my park brake is in working order. Once it builds up to 120 pound of pressure, I'm going to pull forward at about 3 to 5 mile an hour and apply the brake to see if it moves to the right or the left to check the surface brake. And then as you see, it's building back up. It should be well within range in 3 minutes. Now it's built back up to 120 pounds.